Hello friends, in today's session we will discuss about the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is also known as HTTP. It is highly usable protocol in the today's communication sessions if we send an mail, or if we send some data, or if we put an query on the internet, then it uses the protocol HTTP. Most of the URLs are start with the HTTP protocol, and some of the URLs are start with the HTTPS. S means secure. So if we want to send general information, or if we put a general query, then we use the HTTP, or the site is used the HTTP protocol. And if there is some secure data is sent over the internet, and the site is regarding the authentication and authorization is there, then they use the HTTPS protocol. In this session we will discuss the HTTP. First we have to understand what is the HTTP, then we will discuss about the HTTPS. So HTTP is a protocol used mainly to access data on the World Wide Web, and World Wide Web is discussed in the previous sessions. In this session we will only focus on the HTTP. HTTP is more or less provide the functions which are provided in the FTP and SMTP, or it is more or like similar to the FTP, because it transfer files and uses the services of the TCP, and it is much simpler than FTP because it uses only one connection, whereas in the case of the FTP uses two connection. One is the data connection and other is the control connection, whereas in the case of HTTP uses only one connection, where data is sent, where request is sent. So there is no separate control connection, and only data are transferred between the client and server. So next, HTTP is like SMTP because the data transferred between the client and the server look like SMTP messages, and the format of the message is controlled by MIME like headers. And the HTTP messages are not designed distinct to be read by the human. They are only read and interpreted by the HTTP server and the HTTP client. The HTTP server and HTTP clients are also known as the browsers. So SMTP messages are stored and forwarded, but in case of HTTP messages are delivered immediately. There is no store and forward concept is there, whereas as we have discussed in the SMTP, we store the data at the client browser, and then store the data at the server browser, and then forward the data. There is store and forward concept is applied in the case of SMTP, whereas in the case of HTTP there is no store and forward concept is there. There is only delivery of the data which is received. So the commands from the client to the server are embedded in a request message, and the content of the requested file and other information are embedded in the response message. So for the communication purpose of the in case of HTTP protocol, HTTP uses the 80 port number in for providing the services over the TCP. Next, we have used we will discuss about the HTTP transactions, that how the HTTP communication is done between the client and server. So there are two entities, one is the client entity and one is the server entity, and the communication is take place between the client and server. First, when there is a query to the client, that the query sent to the server in with the request packet, and request message, and the server respond that requested data in the form of response message. So the client initialize the transaction by sending a request message, and the server reply by sending a response message. So next, what is the format of the messages? So the next, the messages format. The format of the request and response messages are more or like similar. Like both request and response messages uses the headers and the body, and there is a single change over the request line and the status line. All these things will be discussed one by one in depth in the coming slides. So a request message consists of the like a request message is consist of the request type, URL, and HTTP version, whereas the response line or the status line is taken HTTP version, status code, and status phrase in the response message. So in case of request and status line, the first line in a requested message is called the request line, and this is the first line, and in the response message it is called the status line. And in both the cases there is a one common field, which is the HTTP version. So next we will discuss about the request line and the status line and their fields. So the request or the status line. So next is the request type. Request type, this is the field which is used in the request message, and the HTTP uses the version 1.1, and several request types are defined in the version 1.1, and the request type is categorized into method as shown in this table. Like get method is used to request a document from the server. Head method is used for request information about a document but not the document itself, so information is there only. Next is the post method, send some information from the client to the server. And put method is used when a document is sent from the server to the client. Traces the incoming request, and connect is reserved option, inquiry about the available options. So all these methods are work in the request type. Next is the URL, as we have discussed in the previous section. It is an uniform resource locator, and it is an standard for the specifying any command of information over the internet. Next is the version. HTTP uses the version 1.1, and this is the most current version of the HTTP. Next is the status code and status phrases. These status code and status phrases are described in the next tables. Their codes and their phrases and their description are put in these tables. So what is the status code? This status code field is used in the response message, as we have seen in the previous figures, and the status code field is similar to those in the FTP and SMTP protocols. Like we have discussed the code 100, 200, 300, 400 and 500 ranges. So it consists of 3 digits in which the code in the range of hundreds are used only for the information purpose, and the code in the range of 200 are used for the successful request information purpose, and the code in the range of 300 means that redirect the client to another URL, and the code in the range of 400 indicates that an error at the client side, and the code in the range of 500 indicates an error at the server side. All these codes and the phrases are mentioned here, like code 100 is used for continue, and like code 101 which is used for the switching. Like these two codes are used for the informational purpose, and other in the range of 200, like we see in this table. 200 is used for okay, like this is a successful request. Or 201, create a new URL is created. 202, accept, the request is accepted. 204, no content, there is no content in the body. Like status phrases, these codes are also represent the status of the request, and this field is used in the response message, and uh, it explains the status code in a text form. So like okay, create, accept, etc. Next, the next status codes or status phrases are like for redirection. Code 301 is used for the moved permanently, and 302 is used for moved temporary. 304 is used for not modified. Like the client errors, in case of client error is there, then 400 code is used for the bad request. 401 is used for unauthorized request. 403 is used for forbidden or service is denied. 404 is for used for not found, the document is not found. And 405 is used for method not allowed. 406 is used for not acceptable. So all these codes and phrases are used when there is an client error. Next, when there is a server error or server side error, then we use the content which are in the range of 500, and 500 code is used for internal server error. 501 is used for not implemented error. 503 code is used for service unavailability. So all these codes and the phrases are used in the status codes and status phrases, and all these are used in the case of response messages. So next we will discuss about the header section. So in the header exchange the additional information between the client and the server. Like the client can request the document be sent in a special format, or the server can send extra information about the document. So the header can consist of one or more header line. Each header line has a header name, and after the header name colon is used, and after the column the one space is put, and after the spacing header value is feeded. So here we will show, like in this figure we show how the header is formed. So there are headers are belonging to four categories. One is the general header, next is the request header, next response header, and last one is the entity header. All these headers will be discussed one by one. Like the general header, the general header gives general information about the message and can be presented in both a request and a response message. So the general header is work in both request and response messages, and the header is like cache control, connection, date, MIME version, and upgrade. This is the general information, and it put in both request and response messages. Next is the request header. Request header is work in case of only request messages, and it is put only in the request messages, and it specify the client's configuration and the client preferred documents formats. Like accept, that shows the medium format the client can accept character set, accept encoding, accept language authorization from the show from it shows that the email address of the user. Next is host shows the host and the port number of the server. If modified since, if match, if non-match, if range, if unmodified since, refer user agent. All these headers are used in the request header. Next is the response header. The response header can be present only in a response message. It specifies the server's configuration and special information about the request, like accept range, that shows if the server accept the range requested by the client or not. Next is the age, that shows the age of the document. Next is the public, that shows the list of methods. Next is the retry after, and next is the server it shows that the server name and the version number. Next is the entity header. The entity header gives information about the body of the document, so it can be used in both the request and response messages. So general header, request header and entity header can be used in the or they all three are used in the request messages, whereas in case of the response messages, general header, response header and entity header are used in the response messages. So in the case of entity header, the entity header gives information about the body of the document, although it is mostly presented in a response messages, and some request messages are also used with the entity header, like post and put method that contain a body and also uses the field of the headers, like allow, content encoding, content language, content length, content range, content type, e-tagging, expires, last modified, location. All these headers are used in the case of entity header. Next is the body. The body can be presented in a request or response message, usually contain the document to be sent or received. Now we take a short summary of all these things, like okay, so we have discussed the request line, header and body. In the case of response message, we have discussed the status line, header and body. Now request line is consider of the request type, URL, HTTP version. All these we have discussed. Next is the status line. Status line is the in a response message, and status line is consider HTTP version, status code and status phrase. All these we have discussed. Next is the header in the both request and response message. The header types we have discussed, like header types can be, in the case of request message, headers can be included general header, request header and entity header, whereas in case of response message, three headers can be included. One is the general header, next is the response header and last is the entity header. Next, body is also discussed. So all these HTTP transaction message format we have discussed. Now we take the example. So come to the example slide. Now this is an example to retrieve a document. So for retrieval of the document from the server, we use the get method to retrieve an image with the path is also defined, and method we have used, which is the get method. Now the request line shows the method get URL, because URL is there, and HTTP version. So, and the header has two lines that shows that the client can accept images in the GIF or HPEG EG format and the request does not have a body. So there is no need to define the body of the request message. So we don't focus on the body portion of the request message. The response message contains the status line and 4 lines of the header, and the header line defines the date. Okay, now in the case of header line, what we have to focus, we have to consider date, server, MIME version, length of the document, and the body of the document follows the header. Now this problem is represented in this figure. Like in the case of a request is an get type. So first, in the case of a request, we have to define 3 things request type. Now in this case, request type is the get. Next we have to define URL. So URL is the user /user/bin/image1. So we have to define this URL in the request message format. Next we have to define the HTTP version, and HTTP version is HTTP/1.1. Now next we have to define the header. So in the case of the header, we put the phrase is accept, and next we have defined that the image which is in the either GIF format, and next accept, which is the accept means used for the phrase. It is a kind of phrase, and it is included in the requested header and shows that the medium format of the client which is can be accepted. So in the question there are 2 image formats can be accepted. One is the GIF and JPG. So in this accept, we just show that which kind of document client can accept. So in the header we represent like accept colon image oblique GIF. This is the format of the header. Like header name is the accept, and it is an request header colon space and the header value is the image which is in the either GIF or JPG format. So this, and there is no need to include the body portion as mentioned in the question, so we don't mention any body portion. Next there is an response. In the case of response message, we have to define the HTTP version, status code, status phrase. So status code is like if the server is accept the request, then it mention the code 200, and 200 having the phrase okay. So we defined HTTP version, status code and status phrase. So that's why we mentioned the HTTP 1.1 200 okay. Next we in the question there the question is there, and that mention that the header line should define the date, server, MIME version and length of the document. All these things are included in the header. So we have mentioned that date, server, MIME and content. This information is considered in a header portion, and it is an general header information, except the server is included into the response header. So we have to define all these things, and next we append the body of the document in the response. So this is how actually the request is generated in the HTTP, and how the responses are formed in the HTTP. Now next we have discussed about the persistence versus non-persistence connection. In HTTP, before the version 1.1, all the connections are non-persistence connection, while in case of version 1.1 the connections are defaultly persistence connection. Now what is the non-persistent connection? in a non-persistent connection, one TCP connection is made for each request and response, and these steps are followed in case of non-persistent connection. The client open a TCP connection and send a request. The server send a response to the request, and after sending the response, the server close the connection. After receiving the data, the client reads the data until it encounter and end of line mark is there. It then close the connection. So after receiving entire information, client also closes the connection. So in case of non-persistence connection, if there are n requests, then n times we have to open a connection with the server and sends a request connection. And whereas this kind of issues are eliminated in the case of persistence connection. If single clients wants n requests, then these n request can be fulfilled in a single connection. So the persistent connection uh, uh, includes the persistence connections are included in the version 1.1, and it is default in the version 1.1. In a persistent connection, the server leaves the connection open for more requests after sending a response. So HTTP version 1.1 specify a persistent connection by default. Next is the proxy server. HTTP supports proxy servers, and a proxy server is a computer that keeps a copy of the responses to recent request. So it is an middleware server in between the client and the server that keeps the recent copy of the recent documents that are sent from the server to the client. So HTTP client sends a request to the proxy server first. The proxy server checks its cache. If the response is not stored in the cache, then the proxy server sends the request to the corresponding server. Otherwise, the request is fulfilled by the proxy server. So the proxy server helps to minimize or to reduce the load at the server by handling more of the request at the itself proxy server side. So thank you. This is all about the HTTP. In the next lecture, we will discuss the another protocol or another characteristics of the data communication. Thank you.